Thanks, Stephen. I guess maybe I should stand outside and just use my voice to make this presentation. But, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Bangkok. It's a tremendous honor to be here to talk to you about, I think, some of the trends that we're seeing around the world, but specifically in this part of the world. And I would tell you right now, this is probably one of the more exciting times to be in telecom. And it's interesting because I spend about 50% of my time with investors and the other half of my time in rooms like this and dealing with carriers and customers. And I would tell you, when you go to see the investor side, they're not very happy right now. The Wall Street and our industry is struggling, as well as many other industries. But the reality is, when I go out and see customers, our networks are actually getting bigger. We're actually growing. So there's a huge amount of growth that's going on across the sectors. And there's actually a lot of innovation going on in the sector. So it's it's an interesting time for this industry. And I think we're actually one of the bright spots in the world. And I think that what I'll talk to you about today is where I think there'll be some room for optimism as you start thinking out over the next year to 2 years. Today we're going to talk about just one thing, which is right now there's roughly 7 billion objects connected to the internet. Over the next 4 years, there'll be almost 30 billion objects connected to the internet. This is going to have profound impact, whether it be in terms of what it does to our networks or how we actually go to market or how we actually have strategies. Those of us that are in the mobile space will see some really different changes that are going to happen because mobile subscribers, almost everyone has a handset that's going to have a handset. So what's going to happen next in the mobile space is it's going to be machines having access to the networks. I think that's going to be a very, very big important area. I think for our fixed line companies and fixed line customers, we're going to start to see that they're going to actually have new applications and new ways of operating. So I think it's going to be a very, very interesting time, but a very, very challenging time because I think we're going to a world of very thin networks and very thick networks. And so it's going to be a time when we actually have to think about our strategies very closely and how we operate going forward. I used this at the PTC recently, but it was an interesting set of slides. And if you look at Steve Jobs talked about this era that we're coming into as a revolution, that this is changing. Cloud computing is really changing the way that we'll operate as telecom companies, as computer companies, and as software companies. Larry Ellison on the other side would say, no, this is just an extension of where we are. We're actually moving through a continuum, which is really what the industry's been doing for years, and we're going to continue to do this, and it's just evolving. And I actually would argue, and unfortunately Steve Jobs can't argue for us, I would argue that he's right. I think we're in a revolution right now. We're in a different place. Very, very similar to what happened in 1999 to 2001 when companies started to come onto the internet. We're seeing a new way of using the internet, and I think it'll start to have profound impact in terms of how we do everything, from voice traffic to actually looking at how we do data traffic, how we actually connect to the internet. One of the things that we'll talk about a little bit is what the impact of it is of cloud. One of the things that we're seeing now is that companies don't necessarily just connect to the IX points anymore. They're actually starting to get to locations where they can get to content directly. And this is really changing the way our networks have been built. So today what I'm going to talk about, and one of the things that I love to bring up this slide, and this is just showing, this is a Goldman Sachs presentation that was used about 7 years ago, and they were talking about cloud computing. And the interesting thing when you think about the cloud computing was, what do I actually get as an economic value from cloud? And when you look at, those of you, who in the room has a laptop computer? Raise your hands. Everyone have a laptop? Okay. So typically you're running an i46 processor or somewhere in that range. You've probably got somewhere between 5 and 8 gigs of memory, and you've got 100 gigs of storage if you've got a very souped up model, okay? If you were actually then to say, all right, what if I just put that in the cloud today, right? You could essentially go to 55 times the speed with the same price, what you're paying today. So say you're paying $1,000 to $1,500 for that laptop. If you went into the cloud, you could actually go and get 55 times the speed. You could get 600 gigs of memory, and you get 12 exabytes of storage for exactly what you're paying for that one computer. So when you start to think about the economics, just think of the processing power that you actually get by moving just from a desktop into the cloud. And think about the economic value of that. And then also think of the fact that you can share this with somebody else. So it's not necessarily that you own all that compute power, you only use it when you need to. And this has a profound impact. So anyway, just keep that in the back of your mind as we think about a few things over the next few moments. So we'll talk about first some observations on the cloud. We'll talk about where the operators are going, what we're seeing around the world, and it is very different strategies. Some companies are going in a direction of very much mobile, IoT type strategies, and others are going in very, very focused content type strategies. One of the things we want to talk about is how to prepare our networks so that we're ready for all of these continuums. And then talk about how we get to success, and then finally give you a few final thoughts at the end. One of the things, this is a market that I actually hadn't looked at, but it's really platform as a service. So one of the things that we're actually, all of us are doing today in the telecom space, the hardware space, and the software space is enabling. If you look at what is the iPhone? What does our network do? This is essentially enable applications. We are all platform application providers. This is an area that we don't really realize it. We're actually growing very, very quickly, and all of us are doing it. We are a platform for applications, and we will be. So if you think about it going forward, this is going to be the space that's actually going to grow, and it's what I call the orchestration level of our company. So the ability for us to put applications onto the network will be the most important thing over the next couple of years as we start thinking about these businesses, and it will grow very quickly. One of the things to notice is that companies, and actually you'll see that when you look down this list, every single one of these companies that have a huge market cap, with the exception of China Mobile, the Chinese have actually managed to buck the trend and actually managed to be one of the largest operators. But if you look at it, all of these companies here were users of cloud computing. They're users of software as a service. They're very focused in this area, and they have been for a decade. The reality is we're all finding this out as telecom operators, and we're going to be putting a lot of effort into this. But this is something, if you look at what's happened, if you looked at 1995, all the telecom operators were at the top of this chart. If you look at it now, 20 years later, it's all the software companies and the OTT players that are there. And the reason is because they've actually taken advantage of these economies of scale in the cloud. I think that's one of the things that we've got to think about and realize that this is an area that we can grow. One of the things that's also breathtaking, there's a chart I love to show, which is the speed at which you actually can have a company go from 0 to 100 million users. If you look at, in the days of cable television, essentially went from 0 to 100 million users over about 30 years, or 27 years, I think, was what cable TV took. Radio took almost 40 years to get to 100 million users. Snapchat took 8 months to get to 100 million users. Put it in perspective. Facebook got there in 12 months. This just gives you some idea how fast this new world actually operates and how quickly companies can go from 0 to the end. And these aren't flash-in-the-pan companies like they were in 2001, where there's a PowerPoint and a lot of users. These are companies that are actually generating free cash flow. They're actually profitable companies. And they're going from 0 to 100 million users and making it done and doing it profitably, which is a huge change. Let's think about where this goes. I think one of the things, if you look around this room, most of you will be the key players in this market. Similar as we saw in China and India with the mobile space, where essentially people didn't actually get on the internet for the first time with a fixed line. They actually got onto the networks using a wireless device. I believe that actually in the emerging markets, many of the next generation of computer users won't actually get there using a laptop. They'll actually get there using a thin client. And the reason for that is because of the economics. And what I think, when I look at this, I believe that the place that we're going to see the most growth is in what I call the emerging market corridor. And this is the area from Japan to Eastern Europe. Latin America aside, which obviously will have its own growth continuum. This part of the world is where most of the users are going to be. And I'll give you some of the interesting statistics, which will, I think, are a little bit mind-blowing when you start to break it down. First, you look at, you've got 3.8 billion non-users who will join the internet in this space. Okay, so if you look at this corridor, 3.8 billion users are actually going to join the internet over the next 10 years. Huge. But the other thing that's interesting is, this is actually a list of all the data centers. Okay, so if you think about the computing centers around the region and through this part of the world. The green is where there's a lot of data centers, just to give you some idea. The blue is where there aren't many, and the black is where there's sort of a few. Reality is, the United States and Western Europe are dominating in this space, but in Asia, we really don't have enough data center space to deal with the users. So you're going to have huge user growth, and you actually don't have a very big data center capability. And that's really partly because of regulation, but also because of investment. Most of the investment in the internet happened in the United States and Europe initially. And I think what you're going to see is that this is going to be an area for us all to grow and thrive. If you look at one of the, this is why I believe those of you that are in the infrastructure space, don't abandon it, okay? If you're in the fiber space, if you've actually got the capabilities, you've got submarine cables, stay there, okay? You will actually be successful over the next 5 years. And the reality is, it's just because of growth. All you have to do to sit in this stream that's going to get bigger and bigger, and it will grow. I wouldn't say that necessarily for the mobile space, but I will say it for the fixed line space. I think you're going to see very, very strong growth in the fiber space. You're going to see a lot of growth in terms of the emerging markets, in terms of inter-country traffic. I think this is going to be probably one of the biggest areas that we'll see growth in the next 5 years. One of the key areas also is as we think about data centers, okay? There will be new data centers built in Asia, and the biggest issue will be how do we actually build these data centers? If you look at data centers today, roughly 35 to 40% actually don't make money. This is something that people don't necessarily talk about, but the reality is it's very different from the industry that we're in. If you look at data centers today, the challenge that we have is how do we actually make sure that they're networks and they bring all of the key components of the cloud ecosystem to bear in the data center space. And if you don't do these types of things, you will find challenges. And I think you'll find what we call stranded data centers or stranded buildings. And there's a lot of stranded buildings, not only in this part of the world, but around all over the world. And the reality is, this is an area that we all have to put some focus on, but it will be a key area for us. And one of the things that we've seen is that the data centers that have actually solved the network and orchestration issues are hugely successful. They're very profitable. And those that haven't are very unprofitable. What about the network? Steve and I were just joking about this over the side, and we were talking about IoT. Reality is, Internet of Things will be an important reality. We're actually all going to have to deal with it. We're going to have to figure out how to actually get these machines onto the network. Will it be the next big thing? I don't know. But I think the reality is, this does create an interesting component, because what you're seeing is you're getting massive network growth at the enterprise level. So big pipes are proliferating all over. And yet, this creates a world of very, very thin pipes, very, very small. Most of these Internet of Things can actually run, the traffic that actually goes to these devices is sub 1 meg. In some cases, it's half of a meg going back and forth. So the reality is, all of a sudden you've got very, very small networks attached to very, very big networks. And how do you actually build your endpoints to deal with these issues? And then there's also security. What happens when you triple the size of your network endpoints? When you have 3 times as many users on your network, and all those points are actually get access into your key components. How do you actually manage that? IoT is going to be very, very important. It will grow very, very fast. I think Uber is just the example, one of the first examples. It's interesting, we were just talking to General Motors last week. General Motors believes that they're going to have every single automobile that they actually bring to market connected to the internet within the next 7 years. And they're actually putting all these applications in. I drove a Tesla yesterday, not mine, unfortunately, but the Tesla is amazing if you look at the amount of diagnostics it gets from the internet while it's moving. And it's extraordinary what you see in some of these new cars. This is just the beginning. I think we're going to see it in every device, in every machine. But as Larry Ellison says, this is just an evolution and a movement of the internet. It's not necessarily a change. I argue that this will be a very, very fundamentally different change for us in terms of networks. The thing that's important, and the biggest challenge, I think, as an operator, is you have to be an orchestrator. And this is different from what we've done in the past. You think about mobile networks, you think about voice and fixed line networks, all we did in the past was essentially connect guys point to point. We generally did some managed services, but the biggest issue that comes with cloud is you actually have to provide orchestration. You actually have to get to a point where you can actually create software or platforms. And this is very, very difficult for carriers, because carriers aren't generally good at this kind of stuff. And I think as we think about this next generation of the internet, we have to come somewhat into this space. We're going to have to be able to do some of this in order to be successful. We're not going to have to be able to do it all, but we're actually going to have to be able to think about this and make sure that we're successful in that area. How do we succeed? When I look at computing infrastructure, we're going to see the market installed base is going to grow very, very quickly. We're going to see wearables. I actually have my Fitbit on here today. If you look at around the room, almost everybody is getting a watch that can actually keep track of how many steps you do, where you are. You can actually take phone calls on your phone and on your wrist. But you're going to see it in every way of life. And so I think the good part is internet is coming, and it's going to continue to grow in many different devices in many different areas. This will give us growth. But it will come in 3 key areas. We believe the application space, which is, we believe that there will actually be a huge change in terms of how carriers come to market. I don't know whether we'll actually build applications ourselves, but we will build platforms. The other key area that I think that you'll start to see a lot of focus is around the emerging markets. The importance of India and China will continue to grow. And the reality is that these 2 markets, as well as Southeast Asia, have most of the youth of the future. And it's not that we're going to be doing this so that we can actually manufacture. It won't be the West coming here to manufacture, it'll be the Western companies coming here to go after consumers. If you think about the youth population between the ages of 20 and 35, this is where that demographic sits in Asia. And it sits in that emerging market corridor. So whether you're going to be selling gasoline, refrigerators, you want to be here and you want to be in these markets. And so you're going to see the Fortune 500 putting a lot of focus. It's not just about telecom and cloud, it's about everybody. Everybody wants to be here to be with this demographic. And finally, the large digital transport business. When I look around what's happening across the board, we are going to be in this business for the long term. It's very, very important for us to think about what has to be done in the digital transport business. Asia, for example, is a group of islands. If you look at all of us here in this room, all of us operate on some form of island. Digital transport is important to communicate with each other. You can't do it via satellite. You're going to have to do it through the water. You're actually going to have to do it on fire. This is going to become a very, very critical portion as we get growth in this region. With that, thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to Steve.